Hello physicists and welcome. In this session we'll be covering graphing part 1. Our learning objectives are: I can define a variable, I can define and identify the independent and dependent variables in a set of data, and I can construct scatter plots from data with proper orientation, labels, and title. Let's get started. Hey, first let's define a couple of words we'll be using. Variable. What is a variable? Variables are the factors that can change a system and the effects that describe a system. And we've used another term here, system. Let's go ahead and define that word. A system is a group of related objects and variables. Let's give a little bit of an example here. Let's say I'm looking at a tree here. Okay, the effects I might want to describe this tree might be its height. And what's a factor that can change that? Perhaps the amount of water I apply to the tree. You could probably think of other factors here as well. Perhaps the amount of sunshine it gets, the type of soil that it's in, maybe even the type of bugs or birds that are around as well. Those could all be parts of that system. Okay, so our system is a group of related objects and variables. Let's look at some other examples. If I was looking at a baseball being hit, the system would be both the baseball and the bat it was hit with. If I was looking at performance of a car on a hill, the system would be the car, the hill, the driver, perhaps the type of tires or even the fuel I'm using as well. If I was looking at a rocket ship, I could look at the rocket ship itself, but don't forget the fuel as well. Variables can be broken down into two different types of variables: independent variables and dependent variables. An independent variable is the factor that causes the system to change. And a way I like to remember that is it's the variable I choose to change. The I here reminds me of independent variable. The other type of variable we'll be looking at now is going to be the dependent variable. And that's the effect caused by the independent variable. It depends on the change made to the system. So that's the way I like to remember that. That if the change depends on the change being made to the system, it's the dependent variable. If I choose to make that change, it's the independent variable. Let's take a look at a couple of examples here. Right, and first is, hey, I have a ball rolling down a ramp, and I can change the ramp angle, and I want to measure the speed of the ball as it rolls down. This one we can end up seeing that our independent variable, the part that I choose, would be how much I tip the board up or down. The dependent variable would be the speed of the ball, because the speed of the ball would depend on how much I've tipped up the board. And I'll take a look at another example. Hey, people wearing coats in cold weather. I could choose to look at the number of people wearing coats as the temperature changed. Okay. It's important to realize that people wear coats because the temperature changes. I want to make sure that we understand that if we always notice that it was cold when people wore coats, we might have this backward and think that, hey, by putting on a coat, we could make it cold outside. No, we put on coats because it is cold outside. Hey, the words graph and chart can pretty much be used interchangeably, but what is it? And a graph is a visual presentation that relates the two measured quantities. Ones that you may be familiar with. Hey, a pie chart. And a pie chart is a graph. Let's go present one here. Is a graph in which a circle is divided into slices, and each of the width or size of the slices represents the portion of the whole. A bar chart. A bar chart is where categories are represented as rectangles, and the height of that rectangle represents the amount of that category. A related thing to that is a histogram. And a histogram is a graph where the area of the bar represents the frequency of a variable. And a line graph shows the changes in a dependent variable as time goes along, and they're connected with line segments. Let's take a look at the parts of a good graph. And we're going to start with the data that we're going to be presenting on that graph. I collected some data here, the amount of time a student studied for a test, and then their score. Probably see here is that I can control the amount of time that I study, or a student can. So that's going to be our independent variable. And then the test score is the effect of that studying. So that becomes our dependent variable. And I'm going to present this data in a type of graph called a scatter plot. A scatter plot is a little different than the graphs that you've looked at so far. Each of the points on the scatter plot is represented by our independent and dependent variables. In math, you might call these an ordered pair, where the coordinates of each of these is given by the two numbers on our data pair. For example, 0.4 and 60. 0.4 and 60 describes the position of our first piece of data. So let's go ahead and start constructing this scatter plot graph. In math, we usually refer to this horizontal axis as the x-axis and the vertical as the y-axis. But in physics, we're going to tend to use horizontal and vertical because sometimes the values x and y have certain meanings, so as to not cause any confusion there. Right. Hey, so the first thing we want to do is label our axes. It needs to have the variable with the unit. So let's take a look at our independent variable. In this case, it was our study time here is our independent variable. So I've labeled that here, the study time. And it's important that I also list my units. And how did we measure the study time? In hours. So along this axis is the amount of study time. Next, we take a look at our dependent variable. Our dependent variable will go on the vertical axis. In math, you might refer to this as the y-axis. Notice I list both the name of the variable, test score, same as I have here, and then the units that we measure the test score in points. And next, we have to come up with some type of scale and division for our graph. We need to take a look at the range, or the maximum to minimum values that we have on our set of data to determine that. Hey, so on study time, I end up going up to 2 hours of study time. So I'll want to make sure that I have at least that much on my horizontal axis. This one I've gone up to 2.5 hours, so that's enough to cover it. I want to divide this into increments that are combinations of 1, 2, or 5, or decimal forms of that if I can. So in this case, I divided it, I went from 0 to 0.5 to 1, 1.5, and 2. As best I can, I want to make these even divisions. The dependent variable goes up to a value of 100, so I want to make sure that I cover up to 100 on this axis as well. So I go from 0 to 100. Most times we're going to want to actually start at the point 0, 0 when we make our graphs. In this one, I've got 10 divisions. I'm looking for multiples of 1, 2, 5, or decimal versions of that, so I could also go in units of 10 points along here. The last thing I want to put on my graph is a title, and that graph should tell the story by itself. List both the independent and dependent variables. So here I've given the title Study Habits, Test Score versus Study Time. Hey, time to go ahead and put our data on here. Now, each of the pieces of data will be the independent and dependent variables plotted on the graph. That this goes to this point here. It's at 0.4 and 60. Each of these until we get to this final value. I'm going to skip the details. A value of 2 hours and 100 points. I'll come around over here. I'm at 2 hours and 100 points. So I plotted my last point here, and then, of course, putting in all those other data points. So I've now presented in a nice graphic version the data we originally had in our table of data. Let's go ahead and clean this up, see what we have here. Okay. Hey, so now I've just enlarged my list of data here, my independent and dependent data, and then the properly constructed graph listing the independent variable and its units, the dependent variable and its units, well-marked scale, and a title that describes what's happening. Hey, so in our physics graphing part 1, can you now define a variable? Can you define and identify the independent and dependent variables in a set of data? And can you construct a scatter plot from data with proper orientation? Now we know it has independent variable on the horizontal axis, dependent variable on the vertical axis, labels for both the variable and the units, and a properly constructed title.